The silver rose, the dust kicked up by her mare's hooves, caught the late afternoon sun like gold powder, but Jake Morrison barely noticed. His weathered hands gripped the porch railing of the general store so tight his knuckles went white, and his steel-gray eyes were fixed on something that made his heart pound like a war drum in his chest. Around her neck, catching the light with every step her horse took, was the silver rose necklace he'd left on her pillow 3 years ago. The same delicate chain, the same perfectly crafted rose pendant that had belonged to his grandmother, the piece of jewelry that was supposed to be his goodbye gift, and his promise that he'd come back for her. But he never did. Marianne O'Sullivan sat tall in her saddle, her auburn hair pinned beneath a practical brown hat, her riding dress the color of prairie grass. She looked older now, more serious, but still beautiful enough to stop a man's breath. She guided her horse down Main Street with the confidence of someone who belonged in this dusty frontier town, nodding politely to the folks who tipped their hats or called out greetings. Jake pulled his own hat low over his eyes and stepped back into the shadows of the store's overhang. He'd been in Copper Creek for 2 weeks, buying supplies and waiting for a cattle drive that would take him further west. He'd thought he was safe here, hundreds of miles from San Antonio and the life he'd left behind, but there she was, wearing his grandmother's necklace like an accusation, like a question he wasn't ready to answer. "That's the new school teacher," said a voice behind him. Jake turned to see old Pete Hendricks, the store owner, wiping his hands on his apron. Marianne O'Sullivan came in on yesterday's stage from San Antonio. Mighty pretty thing, and educated too. The town council's been looking for someone to teach the children for months now. San Antonio. Of course, she married, Jake heard himself ask, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Pete shook his head. Don't think so. Keeps to herself mostly. Got herself a little room above Murphy's boarding house. Seems nice enough, though there's something sad about her eyes if you ask me. Jake watched as Marianne dismounted in front of the boarding house and gathered her small satchel. She moved with the same grace he remembered, but Pete was right. There was something different about her. A guardedness that hadn't been there before. A wall around her heart that he suspected he'd helped build. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up suddenly, scanning the street. For a moment their eyes met across the dusty distance, and Jake felt the world tilt on its axis. Recognition flickered across her face, followed quickly by something else, hurt maybe, or anger. She stood frozen for a long moment, her hand unconsciously reaching up to touch the silver rose at her throat. Then she turned and walked quickly into the boarding house, the door closing behind her with a definitive thud. Jake let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. 3 years since he'd kissed her goodbye in the pre-dawn darkness of her father's ranch, promising he'd be back once he'd made enough money to give her the life she deserved. 3 years since he'd ridden away from the only woman he'd ever loved, carrying nothing but pride and good intention. 3 years of cattle drives, poker games, and odd jobs that had taken him from Texas to Colorado to Montana and back again. 3 years of telling himself he was building a future for them, when really he'd been running from the fear that he'd never be good enough for Senator O'Sullivan's daughter. And now she was here in this nowhere town, wearing his grandmother's necklace, and teaching school like she was just another frontier woman instead of the belle of San Antonio society. The next morning Jake found himself standing outside the one-room schoolhouse, listening to the sound of children's voices reciting their alphabet. He'd told himself he was just passing by on his way to the livery stable, but his feet had carried him here like they had a mind of their own. Through the open window, he could see Marianne at the front of the room, pointing to letters on a slate board. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She looked nothing like the elaborate gowns and carefully arranged curls he remembered from San Antonio, but somehow she was even more beautiful. A is for apple, she was saying, her voice carrying that same musical quality that used to make him forget whatever he'd been about to say. Is for buffalo. C is for coward, Jake muttered under his breath. A small voice piped up from inside the classroom. Miss O'Sullivan, there's a man outside the window. Jake cursed and stepped back, but it was too late. Marianne had already turned toward the window, and their eyes met again. This time she didn't look away. Children, she said calmly, though Jake could hear the slight tremor in her voice, please continue with your letters. I'll be right back. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. They stood facing each other in the morning sun, the sounds of the waking town around them, horses nickering, merchants calling out their wares, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. But to Jake the world had gone quiet except for the sound of his own heartbeat. "Hello, Jake," she said finally. Her voice was steady, controlled, but he could see the storm in her green eyes. "Marianne." He touched his hat brim, feeling awkward as a schoolboy. "I heard you were teaching here, and I heard you were passing through." She lifted her chin slightly, a gesture he remembered from their courting days when she was preparing to be stubborn about something. "Funny how we keep ending up in the same places, isn't it?" He studied her face, looking for some sign of the girl who used to laugh at his terrible jokes and steal kisses in her father's rose garden. "Or maybe you came looking for me." Her laugh was sharp, bitter. "Your ego hasn't changed, I see." "No, Jake Morrison, I didn't come looking for you. I came here because I needed work, and they needed a teacher. It's as simple as that." But her hand went to the necklace at her throat, and Jake knew it wasn't simple at all. "You kept it," he said quietly. "What?" "The necklace. You kept it." Her fingers closed around the silver rose protectively. "It was a gift. It was a promise." "Was it?" Her eyes flashed. "Because the way I remember it, you left it on my pillow like payment for services rendered, and rode out of town before I woke up. That doesn't feel like a promise to me. That feels like goodbye." The words hit him like a physical blow. "That's not, Marianne, that's not what it was." "Then what was it, Jake?" "Because I've had 3 years to think about it, and I can't come up with any other explanation. You took what you wanted from me, left me your grandmother's jewelry like I was some kind of fancy woman, and disappeared. You know that's not true." He stepped closer, close enough to smell the lavender soap she'd always favored. "I left because your father made it clear I wasn't good enough for you, because I wanted to make something of myself before I asked for your hand proper. The necklace was supposed to tell you I'd be back." "My father?" She stared at him. "What does my father have to do with anything?" Jake frowned. "He didn't tell you about our conversation." "What conversation?" A chill ran down Jake's spine. "The night before I left, he came to see me at the bunkhouse, told me that if I really cared about you I'd let you marry someone who could give you the life you deserve, someone with money and position, not a drifter who worked other men's cattle." Marianne's face had gone pale. "He never told me," he said you'd gotten tired of playing at being a gentleman, and moved on to greener pasture. When I asked him why, he said some men just weren't built for settling down." Son of a Jake caught himself, glancing toward the schoolhouse where young ears might be listening. "He lied to you, and he lied to you." Marianne's voice was barely a whisper. "He told you I wanted someone with money and position. He said you deserved someone who could give you everything I couldn't. A big house, servants, fancy dresses, trips to San Francisco and New York. He wasn't wrong. Marianne, look at how you were raised, the life you had. What could I offer you? A cabin on a homestead that might fail, beans and cornbread instead of fine dining, calico dresses instead of silk." She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "Do you know what happened after you left?" Jake shook his head, afraid to hear but needing to know. "My father immediately started introducing me to suitable young men, rich men's sons mostly, bankers and lawyers and politicians. I went along with it at first, thinking maybe he was right, maybe I needed to forget about you and be practical, but none of them," she wiped at her eyes impatiently, "none of them made me feel anything. They were polite and boring and safe, and when they kissed me I felt nothing." "Marianne, I'm not finished." Her voice was stronger now, edged with the fire he'd always loved about her. "After 6 months of that, I told my father I wasn't going to marry any of them, that I'd rather be a spinster than settle for a man I didn't love. He said I was being foolish, that love was a luxury I couldn't afford, that someday I'd thank him for steering me away from a man who would only bring me heartache." She touched the necklace again. "But I kept this, Jake. Even when he tried to make me throw it away, I kept it. Because no matter what he said about you, no matter how much it hurt that you'd left, I couldn't believe that what we had meant nothing to you." Jake felt like he'd been kicked by a horse. 3 years they'd both been suffering, both been manipulated by a man who thought he knew what was best for his daughter. "What happened then?" he asked. "How did you end up here?" A bitter smile crossed her face. "Oh, the story gets better. About a year ago my father suffered financial reversals. Bad investments, they said. Suddenly all those rich suitors disappeared like smoke. Turned out they weren't interested in Senator O'Sullivan's daughter if she didn't come with a dowry. Jake's hands clenched into fists. Where is he now? Dead. The word was flat, emotionless. Heart attack 6 months ago. Left me with debts I couldn't pay and creditors circling like vultures. I sold everything, the house, the furniture, mother's jewelry, everything except this. She touched the necklace, used the money to pay off what I could and bought myself a teaching certificate. When I heard Copper Creek needed a school teacher, it seemed like as good a place as any to start over. They stood in silence, the weight of 3 years of misunderstanding hanging between them. Finally Jake spoke. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for leaving the way I did, for believing your father instead of talking to you, for letting my pride get in the way of what we had, and I'm sorry for believing him when he said you'd gotten tired of me, for not fighting for us the way I should have. More silence. From inside the schoolhouse came the sound of children getting restless, chairs scraping against the floor, whispered conversations. I should get back to my students, Marianne said. Of course. Jake stepped back, suddenly unsure of himself. 3 years was a long time. They weren't the same people they'd been. Marianne, I'm glad you're all right, Jake, she said softly. I used to worry that something had happened to you, that you were hurt, or worse. I'm glad you're safe. She turned to go back inside, then paused. How long are you staying in Copper Creek? I was planning to leave with the cattle drive next week, head up to Wyoming. She nodded. Of course, you always were a wanderer. Before he could respond, she'd gone back inside, and he was left standing alone in the dusty street, feeling like he'd just lost her all over again. But this time he wasn't going to let pride and fear make the decision for him. That evening, Jake found himself at Murphy's boarding house, hat in hand, asking Mrs. Murphy if he could speak with Miss O'Sullivan. The older woman looked him up and down with sharp eyes, clearly protective of her boarder. She's had supper and gone up to her room, Mrs. Murphy said. Doesn't usually receive gentlemen callers. I just need a few minutes, Jake said. We have some unfinished business to discuss. Mrs. Murphy studied him for another long moment, then called up the stairs. Miss O'Sullivan, gentleman here to see you. There was a pause, then Marianne's voice floated down. Send him up, please. Jake climbed the narrow stairs, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden steps. Marianne's room was at the end of the hall, and the door was slightly open. He knocked gently. Come in. The room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small desk by the window where she'd been grading papers. She'd changed out of her teaching dress into a simple green skirt and white blouse, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders the way he remembered. Sit, she said, gesturing to the room's only chair while she perched on the edge of the bed. What did you want to talk about? Jake sat, suddenly feeling too big for the small space. I wanted to ask you something. If things had been different 3 years ago, if your father hadn't interfered, what would you have said if I'd asked you to marry me? She was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands. You want the truth? Always. I would have said yes without hesitation. I would have followed you anywhere, Jake, to a homestead, to a cattle ranch, to the ends of the earth if that's where you wanted to go. I didn't care about money or position or what society thought. I cared about you. The words hung in the air between them, and Jake felt something in his chest break open. And now, he asked quietly. She looked up at him then, and he could see all the hurt and hope and fear in her green eyes. Now we're different people. I'm not the sheltered senator's daughter anymore, and you're not the young cowboy trying to prove himself. Too much has happened. Too much time has passed. Has it? Jake leaned forward. Because when I look at you, when I hear your voice, when you I feel exactly the same as I did 3 years ago, like you're the only woman in the world who could ever matter to me. Tears spilled over and ran down her cheeks. Don't say things like that, Jake. Please. I've built a life here, small as it is. I have my students, my work. I can't go through losing you again. Then don't lose me. He stood up, crossed to where she sat and knelt down in front of her. I know I don't have much to offer you. I've got some money saved, enough to buy a small spread maybe, but nothing like what you're used to. But I love you, Mary. I've loved you for 3 years, even when I thought you'd forgotten about me. I'll love you for the rest of my life, whether you'll have me or not. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch his face. Oh, Jake, you foolish, stubborn man. Don't you understand? I never wanted the big house, or the fancy dresses. I wanted you. I've always wanted you. He caught her hand, pressed it against his cheek. then marry me, not because your father thinks it's a good idea or a bad one, not because society expects it, or doesn't expect it. Marry me because you want to, because we love each other and life's too short to waste on pride and fear. The cattle drive can go to Wyoming without me. I'm tired of wandering, Marianne. I want to put down roots, build something that lasts. If you'll have me, if you'll trust me, not to run away again, I want to build it with you. She was crying in earnest now, but she was smiling too. Are you proposing to me in my boarding house room? I'm proposing to you anywhere you'll listen. In your room, in the schoolhouse, in the middle of Main Street if that's what it takes. She laughed, the sound breaking through her tears like sunshine through rain. Yes, she whispered. Yes, you impossible man. Yes, I'll marry you. He stood up and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, feeling like he could breathe properly for the first time in 3 years. She felt perfect there, like she'd been made to fit against him. I promise you, he said into her hair, I will never leave you again. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. And I promise I'll never let anyone come between us again, not my father, not society, not our own stubborn pride. He kissed her then, soft and gentle at first, then deeper as 3 years of longing and regret and love poured out between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. So what now? She asked. Jake smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Now I go see the preacher about a wedding, and then I see about buying us a little piece of land where we can build a house and raise some cattle and maybe a few children. Children? She raised an eyebrow. If you want them, I know you're good with the school children, but she silenced him with another kiss. I want them, Jake. I want everything with you. The house, the children, the cattle, the life we should have had 3 years ago. We can't get those 3 years back, he said serious, but we can make sure the next 30 are everything they should be. 30, she smiled, only 30, 60 then, 100, however long God gives. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, Jake Morrison married Marianne O'Sullivan in the little white church at the end of Main Street. The whole town turned out for the wedding, and even the children from her school sang a special song they'd practiced just for the occasion. Marianne wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and around her neck gleamed the silver rose necklace that had brought them back together. Jake wore his best suit, bought special for the occasion, and a smile that hadn't left his face for weeks. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, Jake thought about the winding path that had brought them to this moment, the pain and separation and misunderstanding that had nearly cost them everything. But they were here now, together, and that was all that mattered. After the ceremony, as they stood on the church steps accepting congratulations from their neighbors, Marianne leaned close to his ear. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For not giving up on us, for coming back, even when you thought I'd forgotten about you. Jake squeezed her hand, their new wedding bands catching the sunlight. I told you once that necklace was a promise. I should have been clearer about what I was promising. What were you promising? He looked down at her, this woman who'd captured his heart and changed his life, who'd taught him that love was worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. Forever, he said simply. I was promising you forever. And as they walked down the church steps toward their new life together, toward the little ranch they'd bought outside of town and the future they were going to build together, Jake Morrison knew he'd finally found his way home. The silver rose necklace caught the autumn sun as they rode away in their borrowed wagon, heading toward their own piece of forever under the endless western sky.